Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Mary Balkema, and we are honored to have today as our speaker Beth Romeo and Derek Kusa from the Fair Housing Center. And fair housing is not about giving anyone special treatment. It's about making sure everyone gets a fair chance to choose where they live. Beth Romeo is the executive director of the Fair Housing Center of Southwest Michigan, where she leads strategic vision, partnerships, and efforts to advance fair housing across the region. She brings more than 15 years of nonprofit leadership experience in housing and community development, fundraising, grant management, and organizational strategy, with prior roles at the Local Initiative Support Corporation, the YWCA of Kalamazoo, the University of Olivet, and Public Media Network. She's a collaborative and visionary leader. She's also an accomplished musician. Maybe people didn't know that about her. Serving as a soprano vocalist with the Kalamazoo Community Choral, a 90-member community women's choir, and a violinist with the Michigan Chamber Orchestra. She holds a Master of Science in Public Administration from Central Michigan University and a Bachelor of Arts in Journalism and Mass Communication from the University of Olivet. So welcome, Beth Romeo. Derek is the Director of Education and Outreach at the Fair Housing Center of Southwest Michigan, where he works to empower housing professionals, tenants, and community members with the knowledge and tools they need to understand their rights and responsibilities under the Fair Housing Law. Before joining the center in 2024, Kusa gained experience in political organizing and manufacturing, building skills in team leadership, training, and process improvement. He holds a dual bachelor's degree in linguistics and cognitive psychology from the University of Michigan and brings a passion for education, policy, community engagement to his work in fair housing. For those that don't know much about fair housing, the Fair Housing Act was passed in 1968, just 8 days after Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. was assassinated. It is part of the Civil Rights Act of 1968. And with that, welcome Beth and welcome Derek.
Thank you so much, Mary. I really appreciate the introduction, and we are so glad to be here with this group. I'm just organizing my Zoom screens. As you know, it changes once you actually share. So there we go. So thank you on this hot, beautiful day here in Kalamazoo. I hope you guys are staying cool. But we are really excited to be here to share a little bit more about who we are and what we do and how you can advance fair housing in your roles. So today we're going to talk a little bit about the history of kind of how we got here, how fair housing came to be. We're going to give you some very high level basics about what fair housing actually is. And then I'm going to share some local data as well in terms of what we're seeing right here in our community. And then we'll talk a little bit about what you can do in your roles and to support fair housing. And of course, we'll have time for questions. So let's get into it. Sure. So you know who we are, Beth and Derek, and our contact information is on the screen. So feel free to reach out to us. We want to be a resource. I should also say, so I don't forget, that 2026 marks our organization's 25-year anniversary. We were started as a partnership organization right at the end, in the 90s, late 90s, but we formalized our charter and whatnot in 2001 as the Fair Housing Center in Southwest Michigan. So we count this as our 25-year anniversary. So this gives us a great opportunity to reconnect with folks in the community. And so we hope to be a resource for you. And if you have questions or want to brainstorm things, we love that. So know that the door is now officially open if you didn't know already. So a little bit of who we are and what we do. So we are a nonprofit civil rights organization that helps, advocate for fair housing law. Our mission is officially to eliminate all forms of housing discrimination through fair housing education, enforcement, and advocacy of fair housing law. We are a small but mighty team of about 6 people, and we serve 9 counties: Allegan, Berry, Berrien, Branch, Calhoun, Cass, Kalamazoo, St. Joseph, and Van Buren. The bulk of the clients that we work with are in Kalamazoo and Calhoun counties. That's probably not necessarily meaning that there's less situations occurring in the other counties. It probably has more to do with just our capacity to do outreach, and that's something we're working on, is just getting out in more rural communities. But we receive complaints from all of those communities. And so who do we actually work with? A variety of people. Sometimes people think we are really just an enforcement organization, but obviously education is a big part of what we do. But we work with renters and home seekers, landlords and property managers, and real estate agents and lenders, and really anyone who wants to know more about fair housing and their rights and responsibilities under fair housing law. And what we do is education and outreach. So things like this, educating the community. We provide trainings. Derek and I actually just did a training with a property management company yesterday with a variety of their staff. So maintenance staff, landscaping staff, leasing agents, property management agents. So to just inform them of, what their responsibilities are. Is that organization had quite a few new people. So that's kind of a day in the life from the education standpoint. We do complainant intake and case review. That is a large portion of what our organization does. So people from the community reach out to us. They describe their situations, and we help them understand if it really truly is under the fair housing umbrella, or if they need some other sort of resource navigation, which is also a big component of our intake program. We really try hard to link people to resources and do a clean handoff when we can. So, if you have folks in your network that you may be working with at your organization, you're like, that sounds like a fair housing situation. Let's connect and find ways to partner so we can make sure people get the services they need. Investigations, we do what's called testing. And it's kind of like surveying the market. Derek's going to share a little bit later about a little more in depth about what testing is. But we kind of see what's going on in our market and work with communities, particularly municipal organizations, to share information on our findings, to be more preventative in terms of fair housing. Enforcement support, so we assist individuals with filing complaints. There are other fair housing centers that have a pretty strong litigation strategy as a part of their work, where they're actually pursuing, filing in courts against housing providers. That's not a huge piece of our program. We have the ability to do that, and sometimes we collaborate with other fair housing centers when there's bigger cases. But we typically file administrative complaints with the Michigan Department of Civil Rights or HUD. So it really just depends. But we're probably lean more on the education and advocacy side of enforcement. And then advocacy and legal referrals, we do try to connect people with legal aid and other organizations to get people the legal advice that they need. Because I should mention that Derek and I, and no one on our team, are attorneys. We do have a JD on staff, but we call him a legal professional, not representation for us. So everything we share today is educational. And it's important to note that anytime you have a gut feeling like I should talk to a lawyer, talk to a lawyer. That's always our go-to. But it gets a little tricky because we do talk a lot about law and what people's responsibilities are. So just keep that in mind, that we are not lawyers, but always try to point people in the right direction. As I mentioned, other fair housing centers, they do exist. Some states only have one center to represent their whole state. We are lucky that we are broken up a bit more in our lovely state of Michigan. So you see on the screen here kind of the footprint. We cover those 9 counties of Southwest Michigan. Our colleagues in West Michigan have the largest footprint and cover the whole UP. They're listed there in purple. And then we have Southeast and Mid Michigan and Metro Detroit. There's a center of Eastern Michigan. They're operated by the Legal Services of Eastern Michigan, so they operate a little bit differently than the other fair housing centers do. But we're still very collaborative with all the folks here. So if you know people that experience, allegations of discrimination that maybe aren't in our counties, there are other resources across the state that can assist. So now we're going to move on to a little bit of history. I think it's important to understand really high level, like the kind of groundwork that made it possible for these fair housing laws to be. So Derek's going to walk us through that. So I will pass to you, sir.
Thank you very much, Beth. As Beth just mentioned, we feel it's pretty important to understand the history of fair housing, and that gives a bit of a picture into why the fair housing law is constructed the way it is, why the timeline is shaped the way that it is in fair housing. So for this brief historical portion, I'm going to first talk about the original, the first codified segregation policies in cities in the United States. That will bring us into a brief discussion on restrictive covenants, which are tied to housing deeds. And then finally, we'll touch briefly on redlining and the sort of massive influence that has had on fair housing. After that, we'll get into some of the laws and the basics of fair housing. So, Beth? So, the history of segregation in the United States obviously is a very rich and involved history. And it wasn't until 1911 that the sort of de facto segregation that existed in most major American cities was explicitly codified in the law. And so this would be in 1911. Mayor J. Barry Mahul of Baltimore signed into law an actually codified plan of segregation. And within that law, there's this quote at the bottom: an ordinance for preserving peace, preventing conflict and ill feeling between the white and colored races in Baltimore City, and promoting the general welfare of the city by providing, so far as practicable, for the use of separate blocks by white and colored people for residences, churches, and schools. And I pull this quote because you'll see throughout a lot of the history of fair housing, you'll see things like underwriting guides that we'll touch on in redlining, written by the Federal Housing Administration. A lot of these segregationist policies come from this kind of misbegot idea that it would preserve peace. As we move forward in fair housing history, obviously, one, it didn't work to preserve peace, and two, integrated communities tend to be, by and large, much more peaceful, which is part of our mission. Beth? So the kind of origin for this law came from the McMechen family becoming the first Black family to try to move into a historically European, i.e. white, block in Baltimore. And that would be the 1800 block of McCullough Street. And this sort of invasion or infiltration, you'll see similar terms peppered throughout the history of fair housing. It prompted this man, Milton Daschle, to draft a law to send to the mayor to codify a segregationist feeling and policy that existed already in Baltimore. And so the ordinance was passed in 1911, but it was first written and published in 1910, and the Baltimore summarizes it as such. No Black person can move onto a majority white block. No white person can move onto a majority Black block. Breaking this carried fines and civil penalties. And importantly, existing conditions would not be disturbed. So they weren't going in and moving people into or out of blocks to suit the parameters of this law. They also cleverly wrote into this ordinance that not only could Black people not move into white neighborhoods and vice versa, but Black people couldn't use primarily white properties to organize protests against this law. You can go on. And so the those types of explicitly segregationist zoning policies in these cities, um, after the Baltimore passage, they began to proliferate through major American cities. And that brings us to one of my favorite cases in fair housing history, which is Buchanan v. Worley. Uh, Charles Buchanan was a white real estate agent and a personal friend of William Worley, who himself was an attorney for the NAACP. And he was well aware of one of these Baltimore style segregation and zoning policies in Louisville, Kentucky. And so he and Buchanan made a plan that Buchanan would sell him a property, and William Worley wrote into the bill of sale, uh, again, this quote: "It is understood that I am purchasing the above property for the purpose of having erected thereon a house which I propose to make my residence. And it is a distinct part of this agreement that I shall not be required to accept a deed to the above property or to pay for said property unless I have the right under the laws of the state of Kentucky and the city of Louisville to occupy said property as a residence." And I put my finger up there for the clause "or to pay for said property." That's kind of the crucial phrase in this, because on the next slide we'll see that Worley, being aware of this zoning policy, knew that he wouldn't be able to build a house or to live in this parcel where he made the purchase. Therefore, he would not have to pay Buchanan, and Buchanan would be able to sue for full payment of that house. This went up through the state courts, eventually into the Kentucky Supreme Court, where, if you would go to the next slide, Beth. The Kentucky Supreme Court upheld the segregationist zoning policy. They continued trying it all the way up into the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court ruled because they ruled in favor of Buchanan to be paid the full amount for the sale. And because of that, they had to strike down as unconstitutional the segregationist zoning policies, such as the one in Louisville and Baltimore and others. Now, people are very clever about their desire to maintain segregation. And so while these citywide zoning policies were ruled unconstitutional, they found another way to accomplish a similar thing, which is the racially restrictive covenant. And so this is a pull from an actual restrictive covenant. And Beth, if you would go to the next slide. These restrictive covenants are strange in that they are attached to the house or the sale itself. They're not conditions upon the people engaging in the sale, and so they slightly skirt that Buchanan v. Worley ruling. Now, these were also challenged later in a court case that made it to the Supreme Court. Stipes v. McGee is the companion case to Shelley v. Kramer, is a restrictive covenant Supreme Court case. And I bring up Stipes McGee. This happened in Detroit. Thurgood Marshall, who was at that time an attorney for the NAACP, he represented the McGees in Detroit. It's a companion case. If you go to look this up in the Supreme Court record, you'll find it under Shelley v. Kramer. But the Supreme Court was unanimous in their ruling, but shorthanded, that these restrictive covenants cannot be enforced. The Supreme Court was shorthanded in that ruling because 3 Supreme Court justices themselves held properties that had built into them restrictive covenants. So just because these restrictive covenants were struck down as unenforceable in the Supreme Court, that doesn't mean that they've gone away. It just means that if you are seeking to, call the sheriff's office to make sure that this deed is enforced to the letter of that restrictive covenant, it can't be done. There is a professor at the University of Michigan, I believe, who's got an ongoing project with some of the law school students to help people in Washtenaw and other counties, which are outside of our service area, but within Washtenaw and other counties, to dig into their housing deeds, find these restrictive covenants, and cut them out. So if you'd like to go to the next slide, Beth. Any conversation on fair housing is going to be incomplete without a discussion of redlining. It's probably a term at least a few of us on this call are familiar with. It's so named because of maps like the one on this slide, which is the red line map of Kalamazoo, Michigan. These were established by the Homeowners Loan Corporation, which was established during the administration of FDR. And the Homeowners Loan Corporation, or HOLC, existed to better kind of, or rather, these red line maps were generated by HOLC to better pinpoint the suitability, as defined by HOLC, the suitability of certain areas of major American cities, um, their ability to pay back federally guaranteed home loans. Now, the suitability came from the Federal Housing Administration's guides on loan underwriting. And these guides are filled with pretty outdated and racist language. One of the more gentler terms that you'll find is this infiltration by inharmonious racial groups. And you'll see in Kalamazoo, you have red, yellow, blue, and green areas. The red line, also assigned a grade of D, are the areas where HOLC found the least amount of suitability. And I don't have my notes present on the presentation here as Beth is hosting, but these, like, written directly into the logic for redlining certain areas are, this is a black area, or there are some black people living here. And so the protected class of race that we'll get into here in a little bit in fair housing, the protected class of race is really the major engine for why fair housing laws came to be, was this disparate treatment of white and black Americans. And now if you take an overlay of present population demographics of Kalamazoo, you'll see the major effect of the red line, and that is that it has the effect of concentrating and trapping people within the red line. They don't have access to these better loans, and so it becomes much more difficult to move into new housing, build new housing, and just by restricting that money, you restrict access to home ownership and set people on a very unlevel playing field. You know, it's like starting a race 100 meters back. So Beth, if you would go to the next slide, we'll take a look at the overlay of population demographics. Yes, Toby.
Derek, I just want to mention the yellow.
Yes.
Because it seems to me that yellow's almost as bad as red. And that's really critical when you look at this map of Kalamazoo. My house that I sold a few years ago was in one of those blue areas, designated all white or close enough.
Yes. And so that's a very good point. The red line was very kind of explicitly like, this is a black area. You'll see some of the places on the east side. This is a lot of temporary housing for quote unquote unskilled labor for Kalamazoo's burgeoning paper industry at the time. And a lot of these houses were poorly constructed, sliding into the river. And that's why they earned, for lack of a better word, their red line status. The yellow line is where we get this quote at the bottom of the slide here, this infiltration by inharmonious racial groups. And this would typically be non-English speaking European white immigrants, or areas that the Federal Housing Administration found vulnerable to black people moving into the area. So the yellow line was also very kind of closely tied to that racist milieu in which these and the time in which these maps were generated. And then again, yes, looking at the blue or green areas, these are areas of the highest suitability, green being the A, the number one most suitable. And I mean, 201, these are all areas that were got the Federal Housing Administration blessing because they were primarily or totally white. And so, yeah, Beth, the next slide should show the 2019 percentage of people of color in the city of Kalamazoo. And obviously the correspondence is imperfect, but what you'll see is that the red line, again, trapped is kind of a charged word here, but by restricting access to these loans underwritten by the Homeowners Loan Corporation in the 1930s as part of the New Deal, what you see is that these people who were deliberately and systematically denied access to these loans just because of their race have had a harder time getting out into the suburban new builds surrounding Kalamazoo, or just uh, generally being able to integrate more in a geographic sense. So you end up with the red line kind of staying the red line, the yellow line staying the yellow line. And this is over a process of what, 80 years, 90 years? Yes, again, Toby.
My house in one of the blue lined areas had a racially restrictive covenant, and so
Yep,
did all my neighbors. So I don't think the word trapped is unfair.
I
If
appreciate the cosign.
you couldn't to move, if you could not move to anywhere that was blue or green, you really were trapped in red or
Mhm. And I'm not sure, I don't believe on this presentation today that we've got the data points about home ownership, but in the United States, it's an established fact that home ownership is the number one way to generate wealth. So if 90 years ago you were given a major roadblock to home ownership or building equity and property ownership, then over those decades, it the initial setback kind of grows and grows and grows, right? And it's not to say that people can't pull themselves out of the red line or find ways to beat these sort of systemic obstacles. It's just really, it's a real strong handicap. Uh, and so because of, this very, very brief history, you may have noticed that all of it takes place between 1866 and 1968. 1866 being an important date because that is the passage of the first Civil Rights Act in the United States. This was on the heels of the ratification of the 13th and 14th Amendment and enumerated the property rights of these newly emancipated citizens of the United States. In the intervening 100 years, we had things like these racist, or rather segregation and zoning policies, the racial restrictive covenant, the red line. These all emerged to kind of calcify the unfairness of housing in the United States. And so in 1968, we have the passage of Title VIII of the Civil Rights Act of 1968, which is what we know today as the Fair Housing Act. Title VIII was added to the Civil Rights Act of 1964, and the pressure to add it came through the efforts of groups like the NAACP, the GI Forum, the Chicago Freedom Project, and Martin Luther King Jr. was a major luminary of the fair housing movement. The Civil Rights Act of 1968 was signed into law by President Lyndon Baines Johnson on April 11th, I believe, in 1968. That's why April is Fair Housing Month. And the Civil Rights Act of 1968, Title VIII, the Fair Housing Act, specifically protects the housing rights along the protected classes of race, color, religion, and national origin. It gets amended a couple of times in 1974 and then again in 88 to add sex, disability, and family status as protected classes. And then here in Michigan, our companion law, our controlling Civil Rights Act, is the Elliott-Larsen Civil Rights Act, or ELCRA. Michigan was a little bit ahead of the curve in adding some protected classes that would be added federally in future. And then the Elliott-Larsen Civil Rights Act has been updated now to include to protect all sexual orientations and gender identities and their right to equal access to housing as well as employment is covered under the ELCRA. And then in 2024, we added a very important new protected class here in Michigan, and that is source of income. Next slide. Okay, so that is the crash course in fair housing history. So what does all this build to? What is fair housing? And at its very basics, fair housing is the right to equal and equitable access to housing. Another way to say this is that you have the right to be free at all points of the housing transaction, to be free from discrimination. So to me, two questions follow naturally from that. And the first is, what is this housing transaction? And two, what is discrimination? So the housing transaction, like many things in fair housing, because the Fair Housing Act is a civil rights law, it's broadly construed. Its exemptions are narrow in scope, but the housing transaction is broadly defined. This is any process related to the buying, renting, maintaining, appraising, occupation, selling, of a house or housing. Anything that has to do with where you lay your head and anything that has to do with your home is part of the housing transaction. Um, you'll have certain adjacent things like the homeowners association bylaws that might be legislating the neighborhood in which you live. But increasingly, we see things like algorithm protocols and AI policies for companies. These are all also considered part of the housing transaction because, again, they affect where you live and how you live. And so, with that broad construction of the housing transaction, the next question to ask is, what is discrimination? Again, very general definition is that it's differing treatment based on assumed information. But another way, discrimination is reacting to characteristics and not behavior. In fair housing, housing discrimination is a little more narrowly defined, but three variables need to be present for there to be a substantial allegation of fair housing discrimination. The first variable is a covered dwelling. Again, this is kind of another way of saying something related to the housing transaction. A protected class needs to be involved. These are the classes protected in those laws that we briefly looked at in the timeline. We'll go into them more here in a moment. And then finally, a prohibited behavior. And these prohibited behaviors come in all shapes and sizes, all sorts of flavors, and we have a couple of ways of narrowing down or clustering behavior. So we'll start with covered dwellings. Again, houses, condominiums, apartments, all the things that you would generally think of as a dwelling are covered dwellings. Also covered by the Fair Housing Act is things like transitional housing, sober housing, shelters for unhoused people, college residence halls, and dormitories. What is not covered is something like a hotel or motel stay, although those can be covered. This is something we dug into when we were asked a question about what about cases like long-term rentals, such as an Airbnb. Usually it kind of boils down to the presence of a primary residence, right? So if I leave my primary residence here in Kalamazoo and I go stay at the Radisson, my stay at the Radisson is not going to be covered by the Fair Housing Act because it's not my primary residence, right? It's not my home. It's a visit. Same thing with motels. But if you're someone who, for whatever reason, is staying at a motel semi-permanently and you have no primary residence to which to return, that stay is covered by the Fair Housing Act. So it's contextual. You'll also notice here that we have housing construction sites. This is a place where housing does not yet exist. This is still governed by the Fair Housing Act. Indeed, after the passage of that Fair Housing Amendments Act in 1988, which added disability as a protected class, Congress gave a little runway, but any new multifamily construction after March 13th, 1991 needs to be constructed with accessibility in mind. So not only the housing construction site, but the architect's office where they're planning that building, fair housing law applies. It's a covered dwelling. You'll also see public housing authorities. These are organizations that kind of are the middleman in legislating and governing those housing projects that receive federal financial assistance, federal or state, that make them public housing. And then, of course, there's more. Next slide, please. Thank you. And so those are the covered dwellings. The second variable is protected classes. Federally, there are 7 protected classes. Here in Michigan, we expand that. There are more protected classes present within the Elliott Larson Civil Rights Act, but they primarily relate to employment. And so we've kind of elided them in this slide, but I'm going to go through these. The federal protected classes, race is your race, right? You're protected whether you're black, white, etc. Color just has to do with the color of your skin. A darker skinned Hispanic person has no fewer rights under the Fair Housing Act than a lighter skinned Hispanic person. National origin refers to what it sounds like, cannot be discriminated against in the housing transaction based on where you or your parents came from. Religion covers both adherence to and non-believers of practiced religions. Sex federally now only applies to one's biological sex, male or female. Disability, you have the right to be free from discrimination based on your disability status. And this protects people who are actually living with a disability, people who are perceived to have a disability, and people who have a history of having had a disability or a perception thereof. It also protects those who associate with disabled persons so defined. Family status has to do with whether or not you have children living with you under the age of 18. Other kind of foster or guardianship arrangements also are protected by family status. Here in Michigan, we've kept open the protected class of sex to include all sexual orientations and gender identities. Marital status pertains to those who are married, working on getting a divorce, are divorced, cohabitating without being married. This arises from a rather rich kind of body of law that has to do with certain landlords being not okay with unmarried men and women cohabitating as being in conflict with their stated religious beliefs. Age has to do with age. And then source of income, again, this is the newest protected class in Michigan, and it's one of the more important ones, I'd say. I believe it's our next slide as well. Well, just kidding. We'll get to source of income here in just a minute. Here in Kalamazoo, we further expand our protected classes, and you'll see this often. Municipalities tend to have the greatest number of protections. And local municipalities and states can always add to, but never detract from those federally protected classes. City of Kalamazoo, again, we were ahead of the curve in protecting source of income back in 2020. We also protect, as a class, survivors of domestic violence and one's status thereof. You know, if you're fleeing an intimate partner violence situation, you can't be denied housing based on a housing provider's feelings one way or the other about domestic violence. Prior arrest and conviction records. These are protected in the city of Kalamazoo. They are not in Michigan. And these, as well as eviction history policies, have a lot to do with what we're going to briefly touch on here in just a moment. What's called disparate impact theory, or rather the disparate impact theory of discrimination. And that is facially neutral policies that nevertheless, because of how these policies interact, or rather how protected classes interact with demographics and reality, these facially neutral policies will nevertheless have a discriminatory effect along a protected class. Same thing with criminal history exclusions. It's generally not a good idea to blanket exclude anybody if you're a housing provider. And then finally, protections against excessive rental application fees. And this last point, what this mostly means is that your housing, as a housing provider, you cannot charge more to a prospective tenant. You cannot charge more application fees than you have, than the costs you have accrued to run those background checks, those Equal Credit Opportunity Act, or those sorts of background and credit checks. I got a little ahead of myself. Next slide, Beth. So, as promised, source of income. Source of income is what it sounds like. Again, it's any source of income, but the important one to consider when we look at source of income as a protected class is down there in the bottom right corner, rental assistance. It used to be the case that, not everywhere, but you would find people who had Section 8, well, formerly known as Section 8, now called Housing Choice Vouchers. People who had these sort of rent subsidies might be given less access to, say, amenities in an apartment building, right? Voucher holders can't use the weight room. And it sounds silly, or not silly, I suppose. It sounds kind of blunt and coarse, but like these are real things that inspired the passage of Senate Bill 205, among others, in this Senate bill package that adds source of income to the Elliott-Larsen Civil Rights Act. This bill package also adds it also adds kind of pathways to remedying a case where someone's been discriminated against based on their source of income. But so, next slide, please. So we've talked about covered dwellings, we've talked about protected classes, and that third variable is prohibited practices. Now, this comes from a HUD memo entitled Elements of Proof back in, I believe, 2014. Like I mentioned at the top, housing discrimination takes all sorts of forms. Quite often it's subtler than someone just saying from jump, like, hey, no, you're black, you can't live here. Right? That's pretty blunt. But because of this kind of broad spread of what housing discrimination can look like, HUD put out a memo that broke them down and kind of categorized them in these 8 categories we have here. So the first is making housing unavailable, which would just be saying like, no, you can't live here. And again, crucially, it has to be related to a protected class. If someone says, no, you can't live here because the person who's applying for that apartment or trying to buy that house can't afford it in the first place, that's what's known as a bona fide offer. Fair housing only applies to people who can make a bona fide offer on the housing. If this person just has terrible credit, and crucially, if that judgment of terrible credit is not related to a protected class, these are acceptable reasons to make housing unavailable because they're not related to protected classes. Another one, and this is what we see most often, especially in rental situations, is terms and conditions discrimination. So this would be something like I mentioned, the source of income, voucher tenants, you can't use the pool. There's also steering, and this is an effort either intentional or unintentional by a housing provider or realty agent to kind of push people into different neighborhoods, right? It's not city level, policy level segregation. It's segregation achieved by limiting people's choice. So it can look on its face benign, like someone being enthusiastic about, oh, I have a Spanish language church in this other area that you'd probably love when they know that the person they're working with speaks Spanish and is religious. But that's steering and is discrimination based on, in this example, probably national origin, race, religion. There's discriminatory statements. I can't stand Norwegians, whether this is said to the Norwegian person at issue or their neighbors, anyone who's adjacent to that housing transaction. These discriminatory statements may generate grounds for a fair housing complaint. Discriminatory advertisements. This is something we'll see a lot with when we work with realty groups, kind of their tip sheets or advertisements that they'll have with some of their realtors will often advertise the suitability of a place for families or young families or people looking to start a family. These are all technically discrimination under family status protections. So yeah, looking for single Christian applicants would be discriminatory both on family status as well as religion. Harassment. Usually this has an element of sexual harassment to it, quid pro quo, kind of deals, I won't charge you rent this month if X, Y, and Z. This is a prohibited practice under the Fair Housing Act. But harassment can also look like just kind of continued badgering of one tenant. Oh, of course, you have this problem. It's always you. You're a difficult tenant. You always have been, et cetera, et cetera. Failure to accommodate applies. Oh, Sarah's raising her hand. Yes, Sarah.
Oh, sorry about that. I was trying to push buttons. So Sarah Stoll, Disability Network. I have a question about the income practices. So people who are on disability and SSI are kind of at the mercy of the COLA adjustment that they get every
Mm-hmm.
year. They can work, but there's a lot of restrictions about how much they can make and how much they can work. I think one thing that bothers me a lot, and I don't know if you can speak to this, is rentals, companies requiring people to have 2 to 3 times the income to be able to rent that apartment,
Mm-hmm.
even if that person has enough money to pay that rent. Um, And we know in places like California, it's quite normal to pay 50% of your income towards rent. But it seems like the practice here and probably a lot of other places is requiring that 2 to 3 times, which obviously makes it really difficult for people who are on, a limited income such as disability and
Mhm.
SSI. So I don't know if you can speak to that.
I sure can. And just do a little forward plug. We will be having a longer training in a couple of months, specifically about source of income and these sorts of questions. But I'm glad you bring up that kind of 2 to 3x rent requirement. Speaking at least strictly here in this moment about housing choice vouchers and subsidized rent in that way, because the way that SSI and SSDI intersect with that kind of, like you said, COLA, that's something I'm not as well versed on. I'm working on it. But for those 2 to 3x things, if you have any sort of subsidized income and source of income being the newest protected class, there's not a ton of case law in Michigan yet. So a lot of these kind of finer point questions, we don't really have a good idea of how the court's going to react to these situations. But in the case of a housing choice voucher, that 2 to 3x, we have clients who have brought this question up. What should be happening if you're a responsible, fair housing adherent housing provider, what you should be doing is if you want to maintain that income requirement, you should be reducing the subsidized guaranteed amount of money from that rent. And so in the case of disability, if you know that your tenant gets a $500 disbursement from SSI or SSDI rather, because of for whatever reason, you should reduce that from that monthly rent that you then plug into the equation 2 to 3x because that money's guaranteed, right? It'd be, and the same thing sort of applies with credit checking. You'll find credit gating that is adjacent to source of income protections, not necessarily lock, stock, and two smoking barrels part of source of income, but the credit scores that you're running should only be looking back at times when people had this disbursement, had this housing choice voucher, had this SSDI payment, because that's the only credit that's relevant, right? It's like, it, this person may have come into their life before that disbursement with bad credit, then they get the disbursement, and then part of their credit is the credit of the United States government. And if you're a landlord, that's whose credit you should be checking in those instances. And how that interacts with people who are on that very kind of fixed income, like people who are living on a disability payment. At this point, it's mostly just waiting for the cases to come in to see how Michigan's going to handle that 2 to 3x income requirement. Yes, Beth, thank you.
Yeah, I'll just add that, it is not unlawful for housing providers to require the 2 to 3 times the rent. The source of income protection makes it so that housing providers should count all of those lawful sources of income. So as we had it listed on the screen, so into that calculation. So what we try to do from an advocacy standpoint is try to work with housing providers to provide documentation for our clients that's demonstrates that all those combinations, including other benefits they may get like food stamps, things like that, other assistance programs, that with all of those factors that they could afford the rent, and X portion is guaranteed. And to be honest, in some cases that is successful with housing providers. Other particularly larger management companies, it's not always successful, and we do a lot of back and forth with outside counsel to figure out if there's a way to meet people in the middle. But the people can, housing providers can require that. But if you have folks that are in that space, have them connect with us and we can kind of individualize a strategy for how to support them. We just had this come up with someone trying to view a property, and the provider wouldn't even let them view the property because they didn't meet the limit. But we were able to get them to at least say, yes, we'll let you see the property, and then we can go from there. Because for us, it's all about letting people have freedom of choice, right? And someone who could afford the rent should be given the opportunity to at least tour and then make the decision if they would like to move forward. So anyway, good question, but yes, we'll plug a very deep dive into source of income coming up. So thank you for that question, Sarah. Does that help a little bit?
Oh,
okay.
Absolutely. And then kind of a follow-up question to application fees. So can landlords be required to show their costs of
Yes.
the application fee? Because I understand there's cost of the employee to do it, right? But I can run an iChat for $10 and I can do a credit check for $0. So I mean, we're seeing $50 to $100 in application fees now. And the other thing is they won't the property management company won't even tell them what they're looking for. So people are paying all these application fees where they don't even know what they're going to look for. To me, if someone has something that's going to disqualify for them for that complex and they're upfront about it, I don't think they should have to pay an application fee and then find out that they don't qualify, because people are just paying all this money, you know. And when you try to ask these complexes, like, what are you looking for? Well, we have a point system, and, you know, some things are weighted more than others. And basically, we can't tell you, and we won't tell you. We just want your application fee.
So I believe it's under the Fair Credit Reporting Act. Anybody has the right to request an itemized receipt of those application fees. And the same thing is true, I believe, of background checks. If you're denied, you have the right to know what in your background check, what in your credit report was disqualifying. But yeah, I mean, those application fees, because I don't think, and again, we're not attorneys, don't quote me on this, especially in a legal situation. But there's nothing that compels these housing providers to freely offer that itemized receipt or what they're looking for. But you always have the right to ask. And if they refuse, then again, that's another thing you should call us about, perhaps. And yeah, my understanding is that, like, I don't believe there's, or at least I can't readily think of a cap on application fees, but it cannot exceed the housing provider's cost. I don't know that there's anything that prohibits a housing provider from going with some credit reporting company that's going to charge $300 just because that's the contract they have. Then they can charge you a $300 application fee. I would hope that there's stuff like that in those prohibitions. I'll have to dig into it. Does that help? Cool. So yes. So alongside those kind of 8 categories of prohibited practices and fair housing discrimination, those types of discrimination can be viewed through these 4 theories. Discriminatory intent, which is going to be generally the least common or at least easily provable, but also carries the highest consequences for remedy. And this would be active and calculated mistreatment of a person based on their protected class. What we see very often is disparate impact. I mentioned it a little bit earlier, and that is a facially neutral action that mistreats a protected class. The example I give to explain this one is let's imagine that a housing developer wants to build housing and strictly limit it to the area's nurses. Career is not a protected class, so this, at first blush seems above board. But if you look at actually who comprises the nurses in the area, you find that 95% of the region's nurses are white. So if you're limiting access to this housing to only nurses, you're also limiting access based on race. This is a disparate impact on a protected class. Retaliation is a kind of special case in that it all comes down to timing. Retaliation is any negative action taken after a person asserts their fair housing or civil rights otherwise. So what's interesting about retaliation is there doesn't need to have been a case of fair housing discrimination or civil rights discrimination. Your rights need not have been abridged in the first place. But if you face consequences after it's found out that you've reached out to the Fair Housing Center or written a letter alleging these civil rights abuses, if negative action takes place after, that becomes a civil rights abuse. That becomes fair housing discrimination. And then failure to accommodate is largely has mostly to do with accommodating people who live with disabilities. So this is someone who requests a reasonable accommodation. I need a reserved parking spot because I have a mobility impairment and it's hard for me to get to my house where I'm first come, first served parking. That would be a reasonable accommodation under fair housing. Your failure to do that, your failure to meet your tenant's need to live fully, or rather to have full use and enjoyment of a dwelling, that's considered failure to accommodate, and it is a type of fair housing discrimination. I believe we might need to pick up the pace just a hair. So if you want to move to the next page, local data, I will hand it back off to Beth to talk about some of the organization specific data.
Yes, thank you, Derek. So we've kind of given you a very high level quick history and a little bit of breaking down what these protected classes are and such. So now, what does this mean for our community? Let's talk about that if I can get the thing to advance. There we go. So let's look at our 2025 intake data. This is real numbers from our organization. So in 2025, we conducted a total of 491 total client intakes across our 9-county service area. 201 or 41% of those intakes were from Kalamazoo County. And then 191 of those, so 39% of those cases involve a fair housing discrimination allegation. And again, remember, people sometimes reach out to us for things like rental assistance or actually securing housing. Those are not services that we offer. We, of course, do resource navigation, but so 39% of those calls from the county actually were including a actual fair housing allegation, and then 98 of those cases involved a fair housing discrimination allegation in Kalamazoo County. So you can see the trends here. I won't go totally through these, but you can see around COVID time that spiked a little bit, but that you can see again, the majority of our caseload, or about the majority of our caseload, is from the county. Again, that is just probably related to reach. And I will say too, these are numbers, remember, that of people who come forward. Think about a time when you had a negative interaction with someone, and would you feel comfortable reporting it and speaking up? We know there's so many people in our community who go through vulnerable situations who unfortunately don't come forward. So anecdotally, we assume these numbers are unfortunately quite a lot higher, but this is what we saw in 2025. But let's look at this year. So intake data from January of this year through April, which is what we have tabulated this far. We'll be putting our May numbers together soon, or we're finalizing those. But we've conducted 146 total client intakes. 63 of those, or 43%, were specifically from Kalamazoo City and Township. There's the zip codes below. And of those, 43 included an allegation of housing discrimination. So you can see here that disability is the number one cited type of allegation. But often, it's more than one thing. So we've kind of laid it out here. You can see that there's, race is listed several times as well, with other things, disability and race, disability and age, disability and source of income, disability and family status, like it keeps coming up. And I think in total, race comes up maybe around 10 times. I should have aggregated that out. And then of course, just source of income is listed as well. So a variety, but again, disability is the number one kind of trend. And that's tracking with the national trends as well. If you are really geeked out about data and like learning more, you can check out the National Fair Housing Alliance's 2025 Trends Report, which analyzes fair housing data across the country. And you will see in that report that, again, disability is the number one cited class in discrimination allegations. But let's talk about testing. Maybe really quickly, Derek, talk about kind of what testing is, and we may need to, yeah, I don't know. I'll let you drive.
Yep. So, as Beth just mentioned, 39% of our calls year over year, more or less, result in an allegation of fair housing discrimination. And so those other 61% of calls, you know, it could, people aren't calling for no reason. People are going through some crummy stuff with a landlord or housing provider. But if that landlord or housing provider is across the board rude or what feels discriminatory, it might not necessarily be a fair housing violation. If they're mistreating their black and white tenants equally, if they're mistreating their disabled and undisabled tenants equally, it's not technically fair housing discrimination along a protected class line. And the way that we figure out, or rather dig into the truth of that, is through fair housing testing. And so there's a number of different types of testing. The major ones are complaint-based testing and systemic testing that we do here at the center. So complaint-based testing would be testing that follows an allegation of a fair housing violation. Someone calls in, they say, hey, my landlord's not letting me build a ramp or anything like this. We'll go out and we'll see if we can replicate the allegation. So we'll use paired testers who have, and I'll get to this on, I believe, the next slide, where we will construct identities or scenarios for these testers who then go out and act as secret shoppers. The only difference between them, or the salient difference between them, is their protected class, right? So we'll have two testers, both of whom are men and male identifying, and one's black and one's white. And so that should be, we give them backstories. They have the same job as reported to this housing provider. The only difference is that protected class assignation. And so we'll send those two out to do a paired test and see if we can replicate the allegation in a complaint-based test. In systemic testing, that's us just kind of probing the housing market and seeing what turns up. And again, we'll still use paired testing, and we'll send out people to, we recently completed a large study for the city of Battle Creek, where we sent out black and white testers as well as testers who vary based on their sex. How does one become a secret shopper? You reach out to us after this presentation, and Beth will be happy to talk to you all about it. So yes, tester identities, as I mentioned, we use constructed identities to control these testing variables so that when someone goes in and let's say a leasing agent, one of our testers, they forget this person's name. It happens to be they forget the name of the black tester. One instance, maybe this person's just forgetful, but we continue to test that to see if it's a pattern. Do they always forget the black tester's name? Do they only forget the black tester's name? And we seek to establish a pattern there that bears further investigation and maybe remedy. And so testers themselves are not looking for anything specifically. In fact, if they begin to start looking for things specifically, they can usually be more easily identified as a tester. But they just go and they have a constructed but natural interaction with these housing providers, leasing agents, whoever we're testing. They'll usually record that interaction or take detailed notes after the fact, and these are later interpreted by the center and our enforcement team. Again, that Housing and Urban Development Memo, Elements of Proof, has some guidelines on how to interpret these differences or how to categorize those differences. You'll notice, again, making housing unavailable, terms and conditions violations, falsely representing availability and steering. The same types of prohibited practices are what we're looking at in terms of the differences in tester experience. And so we've begun being more transparent about our testing methods because, at least from my position on the education team, we find education to be most effective generally in terms of reducing the amount of discrimination in the area by educating those who have the possibility of discriminating, i.e. housing providers, real estate agents, insurance agents, the people who can generate that kind of who can generate those civil rights violations. And by revealing testing methods and making the market aware that we're out there and testing, we hope to keep people on their best behavior, more or less. The ideal housing market is not going to return any differences between testers in these paired tests, and is going to just have a consistent application of rules, policies, and procedures that don't change based on a person's protected class. Next slide. So I'm going to talk a little bit about what we can do as a community to help assure a fair housing compliant housing market. The first and foremost, I don't know, Beth, you've just unmuted. Do you want to take that? Okay.
Oh, no, I was going to let you do it, but just to say that I'm going to step away for like 2 seconds for a comfort break, but I'll be back. So linger on this.
I'll pace it appropriately. So fair housing starts with all of us, right? As I mentioned, we find education to be most effective in terms of stopping discrimination when we can when we can correctly educate those people who have the capacity to discriminate against a resident in the first place. However, educating residents and tenants of their rights versus a housing provider of their responsibilities, that helps people to recognize discrimination and allows them to know when they should be reaching out and calling us, when they should be asserting their civil rights. So knowing your rights and responsibilities is step one. I'll go to tabling events and people are completely unfamiliar with even the term fair housing. So familiarizing yourself with your protections under the Fair Housing Act, if you happen to be a property owner or housing manager, familiarizing yourself with your responsibilities under the Act. I mean, even at bare minimum, familiarizing yourself with these protected classes that we have through the Civil Rights Act. Speaking up when you see discrimination, anyone is empowered to make a fair housing complaint on behalf of anyone. So you don't need to necessarily be the person who's enduring the injury. If it's your neighbor, if you're working at a property management company, if you're a maintenance person who's contracted to work through that housing management company, if you see something that feels fishy, that feels like an abridgment of someone's civil rights, speak up. What is the New York thing? If you see something, say something. Our phones are always open. And then finally, promoting inclusive practices. Just investing in diversity as a benefit is kind of a just base policy that's going to keep you from really running afoul of a lot of fair housing law. So we're waiting for Beth to go on to the next slide of further recommendations on how to remain fair housing compliant. And so I guess I'll take a little moment. Does anyone have any questions just now? I'll vamp, I suppose. Yep, Beth is
I'm
back.
back, so it's okay.
Next slide.
Thank you. Maybe, there we go.
And, alongside fostering inclusion and investing in diversity as a benefit, supporting accessibility and equity, as I mentioned, part of the 1988 Fair Housing Amendments package, all multifamily housing needs to be accessibly constructed. But it's not the case that every disabled person lives in multifamily housing, or the case that every house that a disabled person lives in. We do help folks write letters of recommendation. Our legal team lead, Zach Perkins, has been taking the lion's share of that responsibility. So yes, if you need help with reasonable accommodation letters, call us or email us, and we'll be happy to help you. So not every disabled person lives in multifamily construction, and not every house that a disabled person lives in is an accessible construction. So keeping accessibility in mind, being open to the needs of disabled people who assert those needs is a very good way to foster fair housing. Partnering with local organizations, like being on this call, is also a very helpful step. And educating others, sharing what you've learned today. And if you don't feel like a fair housing expert, you're not meant to be after one call. I've been doing this for 2 years now, and I'm still learning every day. But if you have further questions, obviously contact us. I'm happy to get into the nitty gritty. but just talking with people about their rights and responsibilities under civil rights laws is a very helpful thing to do. And then finally, I'm going to let Beth kick it off with the call to action,
Yeah, so
or
I
take it
think
away.
thank you. I think what we really want to hit home is make fair housing a part of your daily decisions and your policies. Even if you can take one thing away from this beyond just learning more about who we are and what we do, how can you interact with fair housing in your roles and in your life in the community? If you don't think you are adjacent to fair housing, I'm here to tell you you are.
Mm-hmm.
I know you all know that. But how can you help advocate for people in need? So, discrimination it sometimes is blatant, it's very blunt. Sometimes people do say, I don't want you of this protected class, living where I am and things like that. But there are so many secretive ways that discrimination occurs. And a lot of times people don't know they're being discriminated against. So if we can continue to educate the community and educate ourselves, it helps the awareness of our own rights and responsibilities. So just
Hey
keep on
Beth,
keeping on.
Wendy
Yeah.
has a question. How do you work with the Civil Rights Board in the city of Kalamazoo?
Yeah, thanks, Wendy. That's great. I am pleased to say that I am a member of the education subcommittee of the Civil Rights Board. So we have been working closely with the city on some educational materials. Hopefully that'll be coming soon. We're in the stage of getting some community input right now before those go to print for landlords and property managers, one brochure and then another one for the community. But so I'm engaged with that group and have had conversations with some of the members of the board as well. I think something we're working on is just figuring out how we can better partner with the city to share information and stats about what is coming into us from the city of Kalamazoo, and figuring out from an enforcement standpoint how to make sure that anyone who comes forward directly to the city gets a little more support. So we are engaged with them, and that's definitely a growing partnership since, hope
Hey
that
Beth, the
that helps.
next question is, do you
Yeah.
help folks write letters of accommodation? That's from Sarah from the Disability Network.
Yes, we do. We do help people write a reasonable accommodation request, a reasonable modification request. So if someone needs a letter like that, we would have them call our number, or they can go online and submit an inquiry to begin our intake process, and then we'll talk them through what is needed. We've also partnered with other advocacy organizations and help do some like resource navigation with other client advocacy organizations to kind of work on letters that way. So that could also be an avenue. So Sarah, if you have clients that you're working with that you need letters for, we can connect one-on-one too, and talk about that.
If anyone has any more questions, if you could put them in the chat, I will give them to Beth and Derek.
Yeah.
If you don't have any more questions, we'll stay on for the next 15 minutes, but I'd like to thank Beth and Derek for your presentation. And fair housing is not just a suggestion or not just something that you show up and it's the law, and we really do expect people to follow it. So thank you very much for your advocacy and your work in the community. We really appreciate it.
Thank you so much. I'm also going to put in the chat a link, and I know Norm has put them out in the emails that go out, but just another hit on them. We do offer a variety of free training events. Most of them are webinars, and you are all invited to attend those events. So I put that in the chat for you to learn more. You can also sign up for our newsletter, which we send once a month. So stay in tune with what we're up to. So thank you all so much. Yeah, if anybody has any questions, please fire away.
I want to thank you very specifically for working with the Civil Rights Board for the city of Kalamazoo, because those wonderful protected classes that the city added in 2020 are not being enforced. And we really need your help. Patrice Griffin, when she was vice mayor, worked so hard with that city commission in September 2020 to get all the housing equity ordinance adopted, but we need your help to get it enforced properly. The discrimination against all those classes, people, especially people with prior records, being written
Mm.
off without any discussion. And yet there are wonderful examples. Like I just met a person who's the program manager at Open Doors who had several felonies, and she is now a homeowner and a program manager at Open Doors. She's been able to do everything to turn her life around, but she has too many felonies to have them expunged.
Hmm.
Asking for the governor to pardon her, which is the step remaining for her. So now I know that's what I'm praying for. But she's such a great example about people who have prior convictions being able to truly turn their lives around and be contributing to the community in so many positive ways. Every property manager or landlord should always talk with someone that has a record to see whether they really are the, how would they say it? They'd say, you're not a good bet for us to rent,
Yeah. I mean,
right?
yeah, if you believe in a rehabilitative model of criminal justice, you should be fully willing to help people with reentry. And it's certainly, um, there's a lot of work in the fair housing kind of broader, the fair housing cinematic universe, to advance that sort of criminal record and eviction based, or excuse me, felony based fair housing civil rights. People are working to incorporate that much as source of income. Doesn't have as much traction yet, but yeah,
We could be
it's
a
enough.
model to other places all across the state and beyond if we could really
Mhm.
work on the enforcement. Other cities in Michigan have been doing it, but we're not there yet. So thank you so much for the ways you're helping with the Civil Rights Board. Um,
Doing what we can.
Well, if is nothing else, I think, Norm, are we passing it back to you for next on the agenda? Thank you, everyone, so much.
Thank you.
you.
Oh, really? Did you want to take over?
Who'd you say, Norm?
Mary, did she want to take over? Is she still here? Maybe
Yeah.
she had to.
No, I'm still here. So this is the time on the agenda. If anyone has anything to bring in front of Housing Matters, is your time to do that, or to write anything in the group chat for the good of the order. Or I do have a couple announcements. One is the Kalamazoo Community Courtyard is having their open house on Friday from 12 to 3. There's an ice cream truck, food trucks, and you will have an opportunity to tour the new facility on Duke Street. So it's a partnership with a Y, and it's housing for survivors of human trafficking. So it's 19 units. We're super excited that this is um, at the finish line, and it is beautiful inside. The finishes are very nice, and I would encourage everyone to come on Friday from noon to 3. There'll be comments at 12:30 to get some food and ice cream and tour the facility. Willa?
Hi everybody. I just wanted to take a moment to introduce you all to Brandon Mione in his new role as our housing voucher program specialist here at Kalamazoo County. So Brandon's going to be helping to architect and administer the local vouchers that the county received funding for through our Keys to Kalamazoo donation. So I'm sure many of you know Brandon in his previous role through ISK, but I just wanted to reintroduce him in his new role. And I don't know, Brandon, if you want to say anything, you can feel free.
Yeah, thanks, Willa. I appreciate it. I do recognize a lot of names. I think a lot of you guys might recognize me too. I'm really excited to work for the county. Willa and Mary have been really inviting and warming. Um, their leadership is going to take this thing pretty far, I think. So I'm excited, and just thank you guys. I appreciate it.
So Brandon's office is brand new and it's in the landing place. And so we have two offices there and the housing department has room. So if you're at the landing place or going by, you can always wave to Brandon and he is in there working hard on our voucher program. So we're very excited about him.
I would love to hear more about the voucher program. How many, is there a number of vouchers that you have the funding for? And are there locations that are already um, uh, places that?
That's a great question. We just hired him and he started on Monday. And so
Oh,
we're developing the program
Yeah,
from
slow down,
scratch.
Toby.
Yes, hang on, Toby. So we will do a presentation and we will have it up and ready in the fourth quarter of this year. So obviously when you develop something from scratch, you need to do some groundwork. So we will have everything ready and maybe we'll have Brandon and Willa do a presentation to this group and then everyone will have a front row seat to what we're doing.
all right. Which month do you want? We're going to put you there on the calendar.
We want September because October, November, December will be up and running. And we have $7 million over 3 years since you asked, Toby. We want to be transparent. We have $7 million to administer over 3 years. And so what that looks like with unrestricted money, you'll find out.
So we should put you on the calendar for September for
Yeah.
housing. All right, you got it.
Brandon and Willa.
Okay. Very good.
Does anyone else have anything, questions or comments or anything housing related?
I'll just mention that next month, Housing Matters will have Habitat for Humanity as our guest speaker. I think Trish herself is going to talk, but I'm not sure.
Okay. Habitat has been a partner in Kalamazoo County for many years and they are still building housing. So that's great.
They're doing it in new ways that they didn't used to do. So I'm very pleased that they can update us and that we can all get to know Teresa Thrash if we didn't know her before. So I hope people can really turn out for that next month. It should be very cool because they've been very flexible on new ways of responding to the need here.
Well, if no one has anything else, I'll give you 5 minutes back for your day. And thank
I
you,
have a question
Beth.
for you, Mary.
Miss Toby.
The housing report for your department for 2025 on the millage, et cetera,
Yes.
is that available now in print or on the website?
It's available on the website. So I will send it to Norm and to you, and you can put it on the Housing Matters website. It will be available in print maybe in a couple weeks.
Okay, I love those annual reports because it seems so slow for each project to get developed, right? It is so slow. It's frustratingly slow. But each report shows so much progress because of the housing millage helping. It's like a seal of approval for a developer's project. And it also, so that to me, it makes it more likely they'll get other funding that they need to complete the project. But it also means that you're looking at equity and affordability in every single project. So that might encourage developers to do that who might not otherwise. So I think
Well, thanks for that. And also thanks for proofreading it. That's been invaluable. And um, I appreciate your plug for it. And I'll have it sent to you and Norm today.
oh, thank you so much. I can hardly wait.
All right, if there's nothing else to come before Housing Matters, we are adjourned. Thank you again. Beth and Derek for leading the charge and giving us information and education and fair housing.
Thanks for having us. Until next time, guys and gals.